Ever been in more than one narcissistic relationship? And did you ever get to this place where you're like, okay, here I am in another narcissistic relationship. Maybe it's me. Have you been in more than one narcissistic relationship? Then this is your video. And by the way, many of us have. So let's start by getting clear. Let's take out, for a minute, let's take out the narcissistic families of origin, the parents, the siblings, the step-parents, all that stuff for a minute. And focus on relationships that at some level you chose. Friends or partners. I'm not even going to put bosses and coworkers here because you probably chose the job and not the people you work with, right? So just let's stick with the friends and the partners. We're going to come back to the family part in a minute because it can make this feel worse or even as though it's destined or fated. So you go through a narcissistic relationship. Maybe you don't know what it is. You just call it toxic or mean or icky, or you just blame yourself. And then you break up the relationship. You break up. And then you find yourself in another, and perhaps another. And you wonder, this has to be me. And I know a nice enough lady who wrote a book that tells you it's not you, but you believe it's you. And it makes sense that you would think it's you, because you may feel, I'm the only common denominator here. I was in these relationships and they all go down the same way. Am I a narcissist magnet? Is this something about me? Here's the thing, folks. I don't buy that anyone is a narcissist magnet per se. I mean, if you, for example, just use an extreme example. If you really want to be in a relationship with someone who has like a private jet and a high-flying lifestyle and a fancy sports car and expensive clothes and expensive taste and a fancy job and lots of money, then yeah, you're much more likely to end up with a narcissistic person. But I still wouldn't say that you're a narcissist magnet. But if those are the things you want, you're really then just fishing in really narcissist-infested waters. Because if you want to use that kind of an example, then I think we're all narcissist magnets or attractors. As long as we have supply that works for them, we are. And since supply, what it means is a little bit different for each narcissistic person. For some narcissists, it's what we look like. It could be our age. It could be our bank account balance. It could be our social status, our educational level, our connections, our job, even how seemingly controllable we are. That may attract someone to us. But that is simply us just going through the world, doing our thing. We aren't doing something to draw them into us in a deliberate way. It's not us waving our arms and saying, oh, you, yeah, look at you. If you feel demeaning and dismissive and manipulative and you look like you might betray me, why don't you just pull up a chair and stay a while? None of us are saying that. Blaming a person for a toxic relationship that they are in, especially if they have been in multiple narcissistic relationships, is the norm. Which is actually messed up because someone else is actually doing the harmful things in the relationship. And yet, as a rule, we tend to blame the person who was harmed in the relationship. And the person being harmed themselves does the same thing to themselves and ask the question, what is it about me? What am I doing wrong? Again, I'm sorry to be repetitive, but I tell folks, really, it's not you. I sometimes wonder if this happens because the world at large would rather blame a person for being foolish than to have to hold on to the more problematic belief that the charming, charismatic folks out there are often not healthy and that the love-bombed fantasy won't last. We blame the person who didn't lock their door instead of the burglars who took their stuff. But why would someone keep ending up in narcissistic relationships? Well, it's complicated because there's so many simultaneous factors at play. The bottom line is that what happens in narcissistic relationships is simply not okay. But understanding why someone could keep ending up in these kinds of relationship circumstances can help give us clarity. Again, though, the onus is on the narcissistic or toxic person for behaving badly. But the question becomes, Why does our boat keep ending up in treacherous waters? Well, there's a few reasons for this. Because listen, I cannot stand here and tell you that narcissistic folks are the majority of the population. They aren't, not by a long shot. They aren't even half. A decent guess from some data myself and a colleague recently gathered is only about 10%. So if you're ending up in these relationships repeatedly, you're actually bucking the odds. However, it's still not you. And that 10% number is good news because it does still mean that the odds are in your favor of getting into a healthy relationship. So I have been doing this kind of work long enough, for decades, to notice the characteristics and patterns that occur for people who keep ending up in narcissistic relationships. It's not stupidity or foolishness or defiance. It is often going too fast and misreading a relationship that is going fast as someone who's really committed and knows what they want, or a person who wants to press the accelerator on moving in together or getting engaged or talking marriage, that this is the real thing. A person who has that kind of certainty can really play on your fears of abandonment and assuage that anxiety that can plague the early phase of a relationship. You know how it is, you obsess, like, do you think they're into me? Are they into me? Listen, if the person's always returning your text and saying, let's move in, let's make this permanent, it lifts that uncomfortable anxiety. Because if they want it to move so fast, it really lifts the are they into me factor in the equation. And that anxiety of wanting to know are they into us can block us from seeing the larger landscape of manipulation and control that often goes alongside these fast-moving relationships. Things like, do you really need to spend time with your friends? Another is not enough time down between relationships. I have talked to groups and individuals, and when I say 1 year off from any form of dating, scrolling, flirting, sex, any of it for a year after a narcissistic relationship, lots of people will sort of roll their eyes, with some folks saying, I have been so lonely in this relationship for so long. Now you're telling me to wait another year? I want to have a family. I want to settle down. I can't afford a year. Yes, another year at least. A year to detox, to off-gas, and to release the toxins that the narcissistic relationship put into you. A year to find you, excavate you, be you, and not censor yourself or hold yourself back because of another person. In an ideal world, you even live alone, but I know that that's not possible for everyone. But at least a year. Find your stride. After doing that, you are more likely to be discerning, to appreciate the rhythms of your life, and recognize that being alone is not terrifying. You may have built up social networks, have found sources of meaning and purpose that aren't just about a relationship. Without that year, it's like the germ is still in you. And the probability of falling into another narcissistic relationship if you move too quickly goes way up. And another is cultural. And people who date within more traditional structures related to religion and traditional cultural roles, for example, around gender, this is more likely to show up repeatedly. That is not to say that a person has to defy what matters to them in terms of religion or culture. You have to do what feels right, but you have to be aware that within any system that's quite hierarchical, that 10% number on narcissism I gave you, that may go way up. Because if the culture is very hierarchical, then there's a power difference built right in, and a power difference that's upheld by the people around you, and that can foster the likelihood of more narcissism. And a big one is missing that there are many subtypes of narcissism. I often use this analogy. I'm sure you heard it before. Think of narcissism as a cake. The key ingredients are flour, eggs, baking soda, sugar, etc., etc. Those key ingredients for narcissism are low and variable empathy, entitlement, arrogance, excessive need for validation and admiration, pathological selfishness, grandiosity. But a cake can also have different flavors. Red velvet, chocolate, angel food, and they all taste different. But they're still cakes and always have those base ingredients in them. And that's where we get the grandiose, vulnerable, malignant, communal, self-righteous, narcissist, etc. Those are the flavors. Many people will go from a grandiose narcissistic relationship, and grandiose narcissism is easier to spot once you know what it is, because it's the shiny narcissism, it's the charm, it's the charisma, it's the showboating, the look at me, the constant need for other people's attention, the preening. And then you go from a grandiose relationship, and then you may then find yourself in a relationship with a vulnerable narcissistic person. Because I got to tell you, in the beginning, these relationships look nothing alike. The fairy tale feel of grandiose love bombing is an entirely different experience than the sort of quiet, perhaps even socially anxious, not particularly extroverted, vulnerable narcissistic person, where no matter how much you encourage or support or cheerlead them, you are facing up more and more anger and even a sense of guilt that your life was going okay and theirs wasn't. And the only way to make that relationship work was to make yourself smaller and smaller to avoid their passive-aggressive rage and control. Different experiences. However, if that grandiose narcissistic charisma machine cheated on you, the sort of quiet, reserved, slightly socially anxious, vulnerable narcissistic person may seem as though they won't engage in that kind of hurt. And sometimes when people are betrayed, they get so focused on avoiding the specific behavior that hurt them, for example, the infidelity, that they miss seeing the entirety of the new person. So sure, maybe this new person, it really does seem that they won't cheat on you, but they are constantly competitive with you and complaining and mad at everyone and want to isolate you from your friends. And because the subtypes can look different and there can be different levels of severity, people will be surprised about 6 to 12 months in that something that started so different now feels so familiarly toxic. There is also knowledge. Most people didn't know this whole how does narcissism show up in relationships 10 to 15 years ago. We have definitely seen a shift in the kind of information that is getting out there. More folks get it and see it, but until you get it and see it, it's easy to fall into it. A narcissistic relationship often ticks a lot of boxes initially. It's all the things we want a relationship to be. It can even feel like it's custom made for us. It's intense when we want it to be intense. It's fun. It's a place where we feel like we can be helpful to someone, where we feel inspired by them. And that is often that ultra focus that the narcissistic person, like an ultra attunement that they have in the beginning of the relationship, that subsequently fades and leave you wondering if you're the problem. So if you don't know what you are looking at, then getting stuck in these kinds of narcissistic relationships more than once, it becomes quite possible because of this. And I can't sit here and say, well, you need to be in a good place and then you'll avoid all of this. No. The number of people who have said they were at the top of their game when they met the narcissistic person. So many. When they met them, they felt good about their lives, they loved their job and their friends, and they were in a good spot in their lives. It's quite high. And the idea of the shrinking violet who is insecure being the one who is the most likely to get into a narcissistic relationship is actually nonsense, and it's kind of a dangerous myth. And in some ways, the win for the narcissistic person is to be able to control the successful person that they meet. That's kind of a bigger get. So they may be more determined at it if you really are at the top of your game when you meet them. That means that if you don't understand narcissism and you also believe all the stuff about how love is sacrifice and giving up parts of yourself, then you can see how this happens to anyone. There is research out there that suggests that narcissistic people are more successful at dating. So while they may be only 10% of folks, they may be better able to get a person's attention on dating apps, in a meet cute at the grocery store, through friends, and are always going to be willing to be more insistent during a dating process, and just their obsessive commitment to it may just get you that way. They may be better able to play the entire dating game since it is all more superficial for them. So narcissists tend to be able to do more of a volume business with dating until they select a target to give most of their focus to. Then, of course, looping back, there are our backstories. Narcissism may just feel more familiar to some of us, and it means constantly having to be mindful and self-aware while also evaluating another person's behavior. And this isn't just limited to dating, but also friendships or even in the workplace. Sadly, being the butt of the joke may just feel natural to us because it always happened in our families. That being dismissed doesn't even get noticed by us. That someone controlling us, again, it feels automatic, reflexive. And that is a heavier burden that's carried by people who grew up in these kinds of systems. To break out of that conditioning, it's hard, and it can still carry a primal pull. So it can feel like you're always getting into these relationships because the very first relationship you had, a parent, had these narcissistic dynamics, and it's very difficult to break out of that cycle. But the first step is understanding how being raised in a toxic system is a sort of infection that builds up our tolerance to ongoing and future toxic behavior. Unfortunately, for those of us who had a narcissistic parent, the repeated narcissistic relationships in adulthood can feel almost destined. And we can easily believe that this is now and this is how it is, and when it happens again and again, or this is the best I can do. It's not. It's not your destiny. Everyone needs to do what I call a relationship self-study. Ask yourself, what attributes of a person are you most drawn to? What defenses in you may be weakened if the person brings those attributes? What things are you looking for? And as a result, because you're looking for those things when you find them, your vision may be a little bit more blurry to see patterns that you don't want to see. And there's a lot more than that. We actually have a course coming out on this and how to do one of these self-studies on yourself. We'll keep you up to date on that. But it's that deep dive into us that we never do. Heaven knows we do it in school and we do deep dives at the doctor's office, but ironically, these decisions we make on relationships may be some of the most momentous, impactful decisions we make, and yet we never quite do this. We never quite give ourselves a relationship physical. I don't buy that the best way to avoid a narcissistic relationship is to not get into it in the first place. I think that the best way to avoid getting into one is to avoid getting stuck into one, because if we focus on simply not getting into one, we become scared of everyone. We take no chances and we get stuck and frozen, and we do stop trusting any future relationships. But if we can build up that sense of self, that we can clearly identify these patterns, the confidence that it takes to do that, and see them as patterns, and recognize our vulnerabilities, and understand what trauma bonding is and our stuck factors. But most importantly, also know who we are and what we're about. Really know that, and recognize when parts of us that are us are being shut down, and give ourselves permission to walk away when it feels unsettling in our guts, and not wait until it travels from here all the way up to here. When we listen to our bodies, then that repetition is less likely. You can't think your way out of a narcissistic relationship. Every single one of you who has been in a toxic relationship or friendship or other adult narcissistic relationship, you remember when you felt it was off the first time. You felt it in your gut, in your bones, in your chest. And that was long before you understood in your mind that it was bad. feeling, connecting with that feeling and believing yourself, all of that matters. And you need the proper tools to be able to navigate these spaces of narcissistic relationships. In this world, narcissistic folks are still held up as heroes and winners and success stories. Maybe in some places they have had stellar success, and yay for them. But never is that success happening in an intimate relationship. The storm of doubting ourselves, the dynamics of these relationships, the glorification of fairy tale relationships, and a society that wants to blame a person in a harmful relationship rather than place the responsibility on the emotional manipulator and abuser, all of that together means that most of us will go through this whole narcissistic relationship thing more than once. But don't fall into the narrative trap that this is something that's wrong with me, that I'm a magnet for abusive people, that I'm manifesting this, that maybe this is all there is. Nope. So let me say it to you one more time. It's not